Well,
So
welcome everybody. We're really excited that y'all are here. Thank you for joining us on, what is it? It's a Monday night in the summer, perfect for a Zoom conversation. And I guess we'll just wait for, what do you think, Kailey, like another minute or so, and just let
sure.
folks come in, and then maybe we can get started.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I'm always curious where you're dialing in from. So if you want to just put in the chat where you are in the world, because I know we have people as far away from, as China. I'm in East Dallas, so it'll be kind of cool to see. Yeah, that's cool. I want to see where everybody's coming in from. I see South Korea. That's cool. Wow. Well, thank you all. I know the different time zones, but thank you for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I know Kailey is as well. So let's see, where else? That's been one of the bright spots, right, about the pandemic, is that we've been a little bit more connected, if even on video. I'll get started. I just want to introduce myself, and I'll introduce Kailey, and then we'll get started since you're all here on time and we're ready to get going. But you all are here because you found your way to Write or Die Tribe's website, or you found your way to writingworkshops.com for this great conversation that we're going to have tonight. And so like I say, we're just so thankful that you've given part of your day. You've probably been looking at screens all day, and here you are. So you might have gotten an email from me that said, hey, here's the Zoom invitation. And my name is Blake Kimsey. I'm the founder of writingworkshops.com, where we have classes in fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and screenwriting. And another great thing about the pandemic, if you want to turn lemons into lemonade, is I've gotten to know Kailey and what she does at Write or Die Tribe. And if you go to Write or Die Tribe, the website, there's just so many great resources for writers. It's a real connective place. And I feel really honored that Kailey, and that I get to work with Kailey, and that we get to bring this event, Writing Through Madness, to you all tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to Kailey. We're going to get started. And I just want to give you all a clap for being here tonight. And I'm excited for this conversation. So thank you so much. And Kailey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Blake. That was such a great introduction. Yeah, so I'm Kailey. If you don't know about Write or Die Tribe, I met Blake because we have a lot of writing resources on there, such as online classes, and that's where we met Blake. And we always are promoting writing workshops, latest events and workshops, which is great. We also have online submission lists, job board. We interview authors. We're always doing guest posts from other writers that are talking about their process, whether it's poetry, nonfiction, fiction, which is really awesome. And yeah, and also I also wanted to plug, we have a new program called the Write Together Coaching Program. So if you're looking for any kind of mentorship or accountability, we all know that writing is so lonely, and sometimes you just need to like vent to another writer who gets you, or you want them to read your work. So we have a few different options on the site for that. If we have month-long mentorships, we have a writing intensive, we have just a coaching call. So if you're ever feeling alone and you need some other writers to talk to or help you out, definitely check that out. So I'm really excited to be talking to Bruce and Claire tonight. Bruce is going to read for us first. He is the author of 2 novels, The World Was and Broken Sleep. Bruce, what are you going to read for us tonight?
I'm going to read from my book in progress. First time I've ever read from it, and we'll see how it goes. So, shall I start?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is Zooming in, tuning in. I've never done a Zoom like this before, so hey, who knows what's going to happen. I also want to extend my thanks to Blake and Kailey at Write or Die Tribe and workshops, writing workshops, and also thanks to Claire for inviting me and asking me to participate. Okay, I'm going to read 2 very short excerpts. Shouldn't be longer than 8 to 10 minutes. I don't fuck up too much. And they're from the new book that I'm working on, which is titled The True Story of My Fictional Life, which is also subtitled A Novel, A approach to memoir. The book is, first sections of the book are 4 intertwined separate books that are non-linear. And then there's a last part of the book that is a linear short story. But the through line for the entire book comes from Jacques Derrida's concept of hauntology, and which has come to mean many things over the 50 years since he's written it. But for my usage, it refers to art and life preoccupied with nonlinear time and nostalgia for lost futures and lost pasts. I'm going to start from the opening chapter of the book, which this section is called The Ballad of the Haunted Cafe. And the section takes mainly place in my head when I'm asleep in the book. And it's not narrated by me. And there are people in the cafe who are real, fictional people I haven't seen in 40 years, but this is just the introduction, so you understand. Writers aren't people exactly, or if they're any good, there are a whole lot of people trying so hard to be one person. That's a quote from S. Scott Fitzgerald, who knew about not being one person. Welcome to the Haunted Cafe, home of hauntology, a movable yet untraceable vessel of the mind, frequented by trickster pontificators, ethereal epistlers, ghost miners of fictional pasts and futures, cancer artists, anima acts, and a cast of thousands. I'm Iris Seymour, and my paranoid and too often paralyzed animus, Bruce the writer, has been blessed by Salome Savant, DNA time traveler, former patient at the Collier Lane Mental Health Facility and Cafe Mainstay, with the acronym BTW that shall be used henceforth for Bruce the writer. BTW calls me his better half, and no, I'm not his external world wife, Suzan Woodruff, or Liberty Persuasion, a fictional better half. For you Jungian reductive types, I am his inner female, his unconscious better half, his intrepid anima act. Consider me your host, your interloculator through this exploration, or some may say, this labyrinth of fact, fiction, fetching, and self-deception. Although BTW is often in conflict with himself, me, and the above-mentioned cafe habitués of his personal night and daymare life, the only people my other half loves, more than me himself, are his kids and Suzan. Above all, this is their story. I'm going to jump ahead to a section that's called Letters of Memory and Desire. And this section is letters between me and people I don't know, fictional people, other writers, people I haven't seen in 30 years, writing back and forth. That's why I say it's nonfiction and fiction, so I don't know. And there are also letters to abstract concepts. This letter is to linear time. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana. That's a quote to Groucho Marx, quoted to Groucho Marx. Dear linear time, in another era, I would have addressed you as God. For your silence throughout history of humanity renders me incapable of making Kierkegaard's leap of faith, and has made you, God, at best, irrelevant, and most certainly non-existence in the form of Yahweh, Jesus, or Allah. So I address you as linear time, my adversary in this process called life. Time may bend in Einstein's universe, but I'm too dim to see that concept. And in my universe, it is I who refuse to kneel down in the pew of time's altar. Time, I have feared you since childhood. Like so many insomniacs, I fight to stay awake, afraid I'll suffer sleep suffocation and never awaken or become brain dead. In hyper nonlinear timelessness of sleep and dreams, when past, present, and future are one, suddenly I arise and the sleep dimension collides with the waking reality, and I must form a new reality. I spent years as a slovenly flaneur, narrowly paralyzed by the duality of troubled sleep, unhappy waking, and painful hours filled with bouts of ulcerative colitis. I lived in a rent-controlled apartment. If you knew the night spots and the right spots, you could eat well and cheaply. New York City entertained as its own living theater. I took jobs that I could quit if I didn't get fired first. So as soon as I saved enough money, I bounded off to foreign lands or imaginary, unnamed places inside my head. I wielded Gregory Corso's wonderful phrase that standing on the corner, waiting for no one, is power. I thought it would be a shield against time's power. It took decades to see Corso was wrong, at least for me. Prolonged idleness sapped me of power. I needed to walk across the street, needed someone to meet. For years I told myself, I'm thinking, observing, preparing for life. Suddenly one morning, the new reality declared my life was half over. I claimed, with more pretension than irony, that I was a professional loafer, like Larry Dowell in Somerset Maugham's The Razor's Edge, hinting at a deeper quest. I was being both truthful and full of shit. When I reread my diaries, I see fear was my best friend and my crutch. Fear of succeeding, fear of failing, fear of living, fear of dying, fear of loving. I was free to wander physically and paralyzed internally as I searched for something undefinable. And then the ultimate epiphany, time, you are my enemy and my best friend, because I can't live without you.
Oh my gosh, beautiful.
I accept that time is undefeated, yet I will go down fighting, ever searching for ways to escape your mind trap. Time, I define your linearity with every page I write. I recall paths I remember and create paths I don't, and I careen into futures not yet lived. Time, you cannot be recaptured. But as long as I can put words to paper, time can be reimagined and is not yet lost. I stare into your vacuum, knowing one day I will be sucked into your nothingness, but I swear our duel is not yet over.
Oh my gosh, beautiful.
And okay, that's it. The book is long, complicated. I hope that made sense. Now I just want to introduce Claire. She's going to read from her wonderful memoir, which began when I was editor of a magazine called Black Clock. I was senior editor, and Steve Erickson was editor-in-chief. And we solicited a piece from Claire, which we love so much. We actually nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and it was picked as one of the 100 best stories or something like that. But it was great. And so she's going to read from the memoir that came out of that story. So Claire?
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a gorgeous philosophical piece, Bruce, and I appreciate your generous introduction. And Kailey and Blake, I want to thank you. I think this is a really great up and coming collaboration between up and coming organizations, Write or Die Tribe, and writing workshops. You know, there's a plethora of great opportunities on these sites for people to take advantage of. So thank you so much for including me, and a special thanks to Amelia Kennedy for introducing me to Write or Die Tribe. Really great. A former student at CalArts, Bruce and I worked together at CalArts, where he was also faculty member and very beloved. So I would just like to read just a short passage for people who don't know me. A Room with a Darker View, there it is a memoir about my mother's struggle with, and I guess that's kind of an ableist verb use, I'd say, her experience of paranoid schizophrenia. But I think if my mother were here to talk for herself, she would say it was a struggle. And unfortunately, my mother and I had a very difficult relationship early on, probably because she had an undiagnosed illness most of her life. And it was when she went back to work in the field of law, that it was triggered. It wasn't caused by it, but triggered and precipitated really a profound psychosis that lasted maybe 7 years before she finally received treatment. And that was only after she gave her law practice up and basically her life fell apart, which was really a shame. So it's about the, you know, I'll just say that in reading Mary Karr's fantastic book on writing nonfiction and memoir, she talks about how to write memoir, and that at the center of it is a personal quest, a question. And I think for me, what I really wanted to get at writing this, because I think not everything does this, but what I was trying to do was to separate my mother's illness from her character. And I think when somebody has an illness like paranoia, which means that maybe their loved ones are no longer people they can trust and they have to fight them to survive, they become a difficult person, and you become the antagonist in their story, and it's not very nice. So it's very hard to separate character and illness. And that was the goal writing this book. So anyway, I'm going to read to you from the very end. My mother did stabilize. She had a very independent life. She was a brilliant woman with a very dark sense of humor. And I want to read just this portion from her final relapse. When she was 71, she came to live with us in California. My brother and I, she went to live in Park La Brea in their apartment. She loved it, but it wasn't going to be for long. She, you know, often she'd have a relapse, usually because a psychiatrist or someone would change her medication and it would undo her and it would cause lasting damage. So this is from that final relapse in when she was about 72. And each section of this book is marked with a little caption. So the beginning, this short vignette is titled Bananas. Over a month into our caretaking foray, my mother's condition continued to deteriorate. She was hostile when I arrived the following morning to help her with medication while we were searching for a new health aid. She didn't trust me to correctly pour out a carefully measured cup of Cheerios for her, but was no longer capable of doing this or anything else for herself. Before, she had been able to do everything on her own. Now, dressing took hours. She insisted that her hip was broken and that she could no longer walk. When my mother was not expressing irritation or anguish with her perceived ailments, she was lying helpless and laconic in bed. She wasn't eating. Former delusions from a previous relapse had resurfaced with stubborn tenacity. Once again, she believed her teeth were falling out, making foods too dangerous to eat. She stopped eating the lean cuisine frozen dinners that had been the mainstay of her diet for the past 30 years, the bland 150-calorie meals she purchased for under $2 each at Ralph's Market. I immediately placed her on a daily regimen of 2 Ensure drinks, a calorie-rich diet supplement, and even this was a battle. Because I did not routinely cook, I tried stocking her kitchen with sandwiches from Whole Foods instead. From the time she'd moved into Park La Brea, she had dutifully eaten a half chicken salad sandwich for lunch, always saving the other half for the following day. I had trouble getting her to do even this now. Please just take another bite, I would plead. The crusts are too hard. They hurt my teeth, she would complain. If I insisted, she would whimper, kicking her legs under the table like a small child. Previously, she adhered admirably to a strict daily regimen of eating certain fruits and vegetables, careful, for example, to eat a banana each day to regulate her potassium intake. Now she hated bananas and screamed if I brought her a new bunch. I don't want to look at them. Don't bring me any more bananas. And, you know, I think she would have had a laugh if she were here. Okay, Beverly Center. In no time, my mother and I were locked in an ugly battle. Whenever she rejected a choice of food or drink I made for her, the sparring would begin. It wasn't long before I was shouting at my mother in the kitchen when she would hover over me while I tried to prepare food for her, in the grocery store when she derided all of my food choices. It was ghastly how low I had sunk, bursting into loud, irate tears at the cash register in Whole Foods and in the Beverly Center after my mother accused the salesperson who had helped her choose some sneakers of overcharging her. I could not handle my mother's paranoid remarks. Fuck you, I shrieked loudly in the Beverly Center like an unruly teen when I found it all too much to bear. I felt agonizingly alone, despite being able to email or call my brother whenever I felt overburdened. It became clear to me weeks into her relapse that I had no choice but to write about my family history. I could not keep the torment of her relapses and my disappointment in the medical system to myself any longer. Whatever else I had hoped to accomplish in my professional life would have to wait. Psychiatry and neuroscience. Studying as much psychiatry and neuroscience as I had time to access easily between grading papers and appearing at my mother's apartment to help with groceries and other daily needs, I discovered the literature on the topic had exploded from when I first researched my mother's illness, when I found out about it when I was 25. So that was in the 80s. I discovered the literature on the topic had exploded with new memoirs on the subject of schizophrenia and schizoid affective disorder appearing monthly. Many people coping with a chronic mental disorder had taken to self-publishing. After reading one work, I was taken aback once again at how little I understood of the actual timeline of the illness. Outlined within these pages were the powerful effects of each of the three stages: prodromal or beginning, acute or active, and recovery, residual. Most striking was a commentary on recovery. The author of one work claimed that it took him at least a year to fully recover from the depression and mental flattening that precipitated a return to normal. As the author described it, it was as if he were blanketed in a heavy fog for months after the already many months of intense psychosis had dissipated. Here I was expecting my mother's return to normal to occur in 2 months. I was not prepared for her to suffer in a state of mute agitation for nearly an entire year, and now recognize my impatience for what it was: a profound state of ignorance. After enduring months of fierce hallucinations, manic sleepless nights, and after ingesting copious amounts of antipsychotic drugs with little to no exercise, what hope did my mother have of regaining her equilibrium after such a short passage of time? This thin self-published memoir with its appropriately dark cover was eye-opening, and I regret that in the midst of a difficult period personally and a short geographic move, it went missing. On the shelves at the library, I found more memoirs, notable biographies, medical histories, works on the history of psychoanalysis, science-focused medical tomes such as Richard Knoll's American Madness, and works of feminist literary analysis and history, including Eileen Showalter's disturbing and immensely readable study of hysteria and the treatment of women with mental illness, The Female Malady. Reviewing these works, not only did I come to realize how fluid our interpretation of mental illness has been, from hysteria and dementia praecox to our present understanding of schizophrenia and its biological roots, I also came to realize how poorly the treatments had worked until recently. Whether women who received psychiatric treatment in the mid-19th century suffered from schizophrenia or not, I cannot say, and perhaps no one will ever know. Showalter, however, details the horrifying use of sexual surgery or clitoridectomy on women who were institutionalized and being treated for mental illness. Overcrowded institutional custodial care continued through the late 1800s into the 1930s, when aggressive treatments such as the insulin-induced coma, which required that patients be repeatedly injected with large doses of the hormone in order to produce comas, came into favor, along with electroshock, the production of seizures by the use of electric current. The lobotomy or prefrontal leucotomy was introduced in 1936. While there was some success in calming patients, it fell out of favor after notable abuses in the 1950s, when lithium and neuroleptics, first generation antipsychotic drugs, became available. In 1959, when my mother first showed signs of this illness, neuroscience was still in its infancy. Electroshock was a prevailing treatment for schizophrenia. If there was no improvement, confinement to a state hospital was the next step. Reading up on these practices, none of which sounded the least bit desirable and were in fact quite harrowing, in some cases deadly, I came to wonder whether my mother was privy to the same information. If so, was this the main reason that she never sought treatment all those years ago? The paranoid type. Doing further research, I was struck by the subcategories of schizophrenia, which include the paranoid type, the disorganized type, the catatonic type, undifferentiated, and residual. Those suffering from paranoid schizophrenia were reported to be the highest functioning, at least in early editions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and in sundry publications. People with paranoid schizophrenia are generally more capable of relating to other people and performing at work. Their symptoms do not usually appear until later in life. Delusions are usually based on a central theme and continue along characteristic lines for some time. A major stressor is often the cause for those who live with the condition to experience an increased intensity in symptoms. Because they often feel persecuted, they can be quick to anger. A flat affect is not uncommon. Jocular or giddy behavior at inappropriate times, like laughter at a funeral, is a common symptom. People who suffer from this subtype category in particular fear revealing their symptoms to strangers. They can have difficulty maintaining ordinary daily activities such as bathing and brushing their hair and teeth. That this subcategory has been deleted from the DSM-5 has left me more than a little perplexed. In his notable book, Whispers, The Voices of Paranoia, Dr. Ronald Siegel reports how the origins of paranoia are believed by neuroscientists to be located in the limbic system, a group of neurons and hormone secreting structures deep inside the center of the brain considered to be highly feeling. The primary features of paranoia, Siegel conveys, are hyper-alertness and hypersensitivity to the smallest details. The paranoid becomes rigid and inflexible. The person is attuned to any possible threat. This seemed more than evident in my mother's case. Her attention to detail was agonizing and a source of great distress. Whether it was the attention paid to a tiny bit of charred skin on a rotisserie chicken or the unfamiliar substance in a pot of boiling soup, the most minute detail was often suspect, indicative of countless potential horrors. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, so much. And thank you, Bruce, for reading as well. I just want to let everyone know, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to ask a few, but we would love to hear from you since we're also happy you're here. So I'm going to kick it off. This is a question for both of you. So I can either call on one of you or you can answer first. Since we're talking about mental health, I'm just super curious what you learned about the stigma surrounding mental health while you were writing your books.
You go first, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I learned about stigma was I saw my mother always through this like incredibly stigmatizing lens. I didn't realize when I was very young, I thought that she just was quote unquote neurotic, and maybe Bruce can pick up on the, sort of the difference between neuroses and madness. But I think, my family, there was so much shame, we weren't really supposed to talk about it. And I think some of it was because we were at that cusp where there wasn't a lot, the medical care wasn't as good as it should have been. I think that I found myself that I feel like, this is definitely a family account. It's not a first person account. Family accounts are a little more suspicious for othering the patient. I think, for me, I looked at a lot of this medical language is painful. And if you were to read the Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Weijian Wang, you would recognize that these books are not written for the patient. So when the patient reads this language, it's very othering and very distant. And I think that's something clinicians and doctors should think about. I sort of recognize now that when I use this kind of very medicalized language, I was fighting to prove to myself and my family and other people, my mother's illness is real and we're not getting resources that we deserve. It is a true biological illness. In the history of schizophrenia, people originally, thought it was caused by demons or possessions. The Greeks thought it was, something that the gods created, maybe it was a curse. And as we went on, it became a crisis of moral character, right? So people needed sort of psychotherapy, and that was good. At least they were getting some kind of individualized, humanized care. But the problem with that is that we are still left with the detritus of believing that it's a psychological defect. And you will find that all the time in Los Angeles, 60% or more of the people in prison or jails are really only there because they don't have access to mental health resources. And we have such a burgeoning unhoused population, most people will always dismiss people on the street if they see them talking to themselves and they might have a medical issue as well. It's, but they're not like the rest of us. So it's not, we don't have to worry about them. We don't have to provide them resources, and it's just untrue. So I would say that it's such a great question for me. Stigma, I see how I stigmatize people. I see how my mother was stigmatized. And I just think, it's important to have family accounts because people need to learn how to recognize illness and need some kind of succor in caregiving, and the trauma of caregiving and not having resources are just the challenges. But yeah, there's a lot of, it's easy to stigmatize people who are struggling with an illness that you know nothing about.
Well, I think that I didn't suffer from stigma in terms of my books. I mean, the character who is insane in my book and undergoes electroshock therapy. I'd done a lot of research when I was younger. I prefer my books. I don't think that ever affected how I wrote or how I looked at stigma. The stigma I felt, I was 17 when I first went to a psychiatrist, and coming from a kind of family where I did in Flushing, Queens, and saying, if I don't go to a shrink, I'm going to have a breakdown and maybe worse. That was a stigma. It was a stigma for my family because my parents were not college educated, did not believe in psychiatry, and it was hard for them to accept. And then at 19, one of my closest friends underwent electroshock. Another one committed suicide. And that was when I started to see that. And over time, the last 35 years or whatever, I've seen the stigma fade from going to therapy. Most of the people I know are on Valium's most prescribed drug in America. So I think the stigma between neuroses or severe neurosis, which I think I had, has lessened. The stigma for truly schizophrenic, psychotic, people are afraid of them. I don't know. And I think the amount of books written about it has helped immensely for the class that reads. The class that doesn't read, which is quite large, I think it's still a troubling stigma, and it's more troubling that most people won't seek help and someone won't recognize to them that they should seek help. I think that's the stigma I saw, not so much in my book, and in the character of Salome, who is in a mental health institution and she suffers a stigma, but it's much more about her behavior than the classification. So I think that's it. I think there was a question that popped up about, which I think is really important, about how you handle your mental health while writing. I would say that writing has saved me from having that nervous breakdown. And I think a lot of writers, this from Fitzgerald, I mean, if you tell people that you got many people talking in your head, that's not something you should admit to a psychiatrist. So I think for writers, I think it's important that you manage your mental health by realizing that it could be a cathartic way for your own mental health, as well as anything else. Anthony Narteau, who I don't know if people know, he was a writer, he was also an actor, and he was put in an institution, and he never wrote again. Other writers like Ezra Pound wrote his best stuff while he was in an institution. He wrote That's where he won the Nobel Prize for the Peas and Cantos. So I think as a writer, handling your mental health is being aware that writing is a dangerous endeavor.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing your personal experience, Bruce, about, you know, psychiatry and that it is very stigmatized for people to go in particular culture. Yeah, that's that's very fortunate. I just wanted to just mention something that Luana Porter mentioned, brought up here, that mental illness is so common, yet so I think maybe misunderstood. It is so heartbreaking to realize how many people of color and others who end up in police confrontations and possibly killed as a result are suffering from mental illness. And I think that, you know, what you're bringing up is really powerful and something I had to really sit with. You know, my book came out during the pandemic and I really had to sit with, I was very angry that my mother, the only way we could get my mother's psychiatric care was to call, you know, the police, and they would break down the door and take my mother away. And I was 3,000 miles away, like just horrified that my mother was being confronted by people with guns who she didn't know, to get her help. But I didn't really factor in my white privilege and the fact that no, and in many cases, somebody might end up dead, a person of color, if they were to call the police. And I think we're seeing those stories like almost weekly. And it's really, you know, it's horrifying. America is very much a medical apartheid system. And I just think, you know, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that these resources are available. I've had students tell me they are suffering from huge depression. They tried to commit suicide, end up on a 72-hour hold, are treated abysmally, and are tossed out at the end with no resources, have to figure it out for themselves, come from a culture where nobody goes to the psychiatrist, nobody has access to those kinds of resources. And by some miracle, you know, their great native intelligence and will to live, they keep going. And I know people who are wealthy, who have had depression and gone in for a mere 2 weeks, come out and they're not stable on their medication. And people don't understand that section I read, the medication takes months. It takes months to stabilize. Some people really dislike being there. Some people need it because otherwise they may not make it. So there's a lot for us to share, and it's especially unconscionable that we have a medical apartheid in this country.
Claire, did you want, oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to say, no, that Claire has mentioned, and you guys have mentioned a lot of nonfiction books that deal with madness. For fiction writers out there, I would recommend you read some novels that deal with that very well. Probably one of the most famous is a novella by Gogol called Diary of a Madman. Then there's I'm Not Stiller by Max Frisch. Then there's Against Nature by Weisman. These are, if you're going to write about madness fiction, those are books I think you need to read. I read a lot of books before I wrote mine about that. Plus, I saw the film Sodom, 100 Days of Sodom by Passine, but it deals with the metaphor of madness and the Holocaust. And the last is Peter Weiss's play, which was filmed, I think, by Peter Brook, Marat Sod, and it was filmed inside an institution. So for fiction writers, I think you need to read the sort of templates of how people did it. Gogol's novel is actually quite funny. I mean, there's a scene where the madman is beaten up and he thinks if he survives, he's going to become king of Spain. Others are Marat Sod, and others are much more serious. That's just for the fiction writers among you. Okay, sorry, Kailey, you're going to ask a question.
No, thank you. I'm glad you gave some recommendations there. No, I didn't know, Claire, if you wanted to address the question that Bruce answered before too, about taking care of your own mental health while you wrote your memoir.
Oh, well, what did I do to take care of my mental health? It was a struggle. I was teaching, I'll be perfectly frank and say that, you know, precarity is definitely an issue in our culture. And I think I was teaching at 4 or 5 institutions while I was taking care of my mother. I had almost no time. I was desperate to write this piece for Black Clock, thrilled and desperate. And writing, I think like what Bruce said, writing was basically my way of taking care of my mental health. I mean, seeing friends and getting lots of exercise. You know, I'm lucky I live in California, so I can exercise when it's not on fire. And I think probably I always needed more therapy than I ever went and got. But for me, even that became difficult because you've got to drive there, I think. And for those of us who have many, many jobs and are greedy with our time, because I do like spending my time alone thinking or reading, I think Zoom might make therapy a little more possible. So for me, my mental health, I think just, you know, being able to write everything down was probably for me. I mean, there's such joy, which is my mother's name, so that's a little ironic, but such joy for me in writing.
Do either of you keep, I'm just always so interested in people's writing routines. For Bruce, for your fiction, and Claire, for your memoir, I know you just mentioned, Claire, that you didn't have a lot of time, but how did you squeeze in that time when you had it? Or structure your time when you had it, I mean.
Do you want to go first, Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, I taught for over 20 years at CalArts and other institutions, CalArts 16 years, UCLA, other places. So writing becomes a discipline. I got up every morning and wrote very early for a few hours. And I am an insomniac, so I would write at night. And during the break, the summer breaks from college teaching, I would go to my studio. I had a separate studio about 5 minutes from the house, and I would spend 12 to 24 hours there, just working during the break. Same with the Easter break, same with the Christmas break. But I recommend, even if you don't have time to write every day, that you spend at least an hour with your manuscript, so it's always in your head. I think that writing when the muse hits you, you'll never finish your fucking book. I think discipline is. I think discipline is really important. Okay, and mental health wise, I want to say teaching. I love teaching in the classroom. A lot of other shit I didn't like, but teaching in the classroom is really okay. That's it. My answer.
Yeah, I concur. You know, teaching when it's like a workshop where you're going back and forth, you know, with your favorite influences, et cetera, it really keeps you engaged. I think, can you hear me, or is this lagging? So, but for me, I think, you know, I think one way that I ensure that I have writing time, which I think most people should not do, is I just sort of eliminate personal life. I think most people don't want to make that sacrifice, but when you have 10 jobs, you've kind of got to find some time somehow. So living on my own has definitely helped. You know, my time is mine when I'm home. Adjuncting is very flexible time. So, you know, when I first started teaching, I taught strictly at night. So I always had the day. So that I loved, but I would say what's really the most helpful to me was my political fundraising days, where you set daily goals and you meet them. So I agree with Bruce that waiting for anything to happen is a non-starter. And people are doing this, what's that Twitter summer, 1,000 words Twitter summer right now, which I think is really good. I just would pick a number of words I was certain to get, and I would do it daily, and I put it on my calendar. If you times that you can easily obtain, you surpass it. And then you've got like words in the bank. So when you have like a great day, a great party day or whatever, then you can take that day off and you are still like, you've already hit your weekly goals. So I have weekly goals. I also noted that I never like working on a manuscript for more than 3 months. I never will, for whatever reason. After doing this for years, I found that always after 3 months, I stopped whatever I was doing. So that gave me an insight into, by like calendaring what you do, it gives you insight into your own rhythm and what kind of attention you have for something. It's almost lunar.
Definitely. I think everyone's got a different routine, but consistency is the key.
Yeah.
Routine is definitely it, because I'm against word counts. because there are days when I can stare for 3 hours and write 12 words that I think are good, and a few hundred that go right in a fucking garbage can. So I think time and spending time, because if you're writing fiction, wherever it comes from, the narrators have to take over, and that comes from your unconscious. So I think word counts. I know that works for Claire. I have other friends who I know that works for me. Outlines and word counts are terrible for fiction, for me personally. Time spent with the manuscript is really important. And that I think is key for me, and I know some other people, because for fiction to work, you become a vessel and the narrators take over. John Wagner had a question that popped up, and I saw it and I want to see it again because I think it was really important, if that's possible. John, can you hear if you can put your question up, or somebody?
You know what, I'll just cut and paste it into the chat again. Here it is. Whoops, there it is.
Okay. Okay, I will answer that in my case, it's both. But I write for myself, and if somebody likes it or publishes it, great. If not, screw it. I gave an interview a couple of months ago to Slice magazine where I said, the day that writing is no longer fun, I fucking quit, because life's really short. And to come back to something Claire said, my wife, and that's her painting back there. She's a very successful, great artist. Susan's laughing because she has a painting. Anyway, she gave an interview when she was 26 and starting out and becoming successful, that she understood that her future social life was going to mean a large amount of sacrifices, but it would be worth it. Many years later, she still sticks to that. So I think if you're serious about becoming any kind of writer, artist, whatever, you have to understand sacrifices will be made. And you have to do that without bitterness or hesitation or regret. And activists, yes, my books are not overtly political, but I hope they have a political edge. Someone once said they were love letters to America, and that's what I hope they are.
Lovely, lovely.
Some critic, not me.
Great.
Okay.
Just for the sake of time too, I want to kind of jump to a few different topics so we can get everyone's question answered. I have two for Claire. I'm going to kind of bunch them together for you. So you mentioned that you didn't begin documenting the experience in your memoir until after your mother's diagnosis. So how did you capture the vivid details of the time? And along with that, were there any were you worried about any family reactions? And if so, how did you overcome that?
Great, thank you so much. I think all along, you know, I learned about my mother's real diagnosis. First, I was told she had manic depression and paranoia, but then I found out later somebody finally spilled the beans. I think they thought I couldn't handle it. I mean, never mind the fact that it's her inherited, right? And I'm a woman. I need to know if I'm going to have children, what's going on in my family. I didn't find out that she had schizophrenia or was diagnosed with it until I was 25, but I never wrote about it. Although my characters, my first novella, Black Market Babies, there are some very vivid portrayals of mothers in there whose personalities, archetypal personalities, may have echoes of what sort of it was like to have a mother who was experiencing these extremes. But I never wanted to write about my mother. I felt it was already difficult for the family. Just enduring an illness, a chronic illness, is tough. So you have to endure it. You have to endure what's not working, particularly what resources you aren't being provided to help this family member. That already takes a toll. So I had no interest in writing about this, but even more so, I didn't want to be that girl who sat down and wrote down. I mean, there are some descriptions of my mother here that probably, you know, if I had to do it again, I may not write down. So I think the fact that my mother was at the end of her life and that had just become too much, I realized I had to do it. I also think that my family was very discouraged to talk about it. My mother used to say every day when I went to school, don't talk to your teachers about us. So eventually I was going to have to, right? People tell you not to do something, eventually you're going to do it, but it wasn't the right time. So some people, and I've seen people try to write memoir when they're still really involved with their family, maybe a family member is paying for their college education. And that's a very tricky matter. I don't know if you need to upend that cart at that time. You might want to become independent. So with my family, my father has Parkinson's disease now. He can't read, he can't speak. He's unable to read this book. I didn't share it overtly. Like you said, my family never, when I go home, nobody ever says, what are you writing today, Claire? So it's a lie by omission. They found the book, and then I got a phone call from my stepmother saying how much she liked it. And they asked me, she said, you were very gentle on your father. And another friend was like, why did you let your father off the hook? I guess for not getting my mother more resources and being a womanizer or whatever. And the not so nice way of putting it. And because, and there were two reasons, I didn't write this memoir to spite my father. And also, I'm not sure it was germane to her story. So I waited, and my family, I was careful when I wrote this memoir to write things that I left a lot out. And I was careful because I don't, another thing I just want to say very briefly is I have a friend, I always think of this when we talk about buying shoes. I'm like, how do you know when to stop? And she said, well, I have this one in, one out, right? Like if a pair is worn out, I get a new pair, right? And for those of us who can't stop buying clothes. And so that's how I felt about my family and their flaws, which ones to write about. I write about, if I'm going to say something about my father, I have to look in the mirror too. And if I'm not willing to talk about my bad temper, then do I have a right to just expose his? And he has no say so? I don't think so. Not there. I think that is the purview of fiction. And I think, and that is my first love. So I think it's much more flexible in that way.
Definitely. I think this last question will be a really great way to close this, but Andy says it's important to not frame any type of chronic illness or disability solely in the terms of lack. In a supportive environment, folks with mental illness can still live robust lives. Did you find, Claire, moments of special joy with your mom? And Bruce, we can kind of tie this into your fiction too, where some of these can be sort of heavy subjects. Where's the joy that you found there?
Well, I'm going to speak for Bruce. Salome is a great character. She has like every disorder. Nobody can really figure out what it is, which is really great because actually what they're finding genetically is that bipolar illness, schizophrenia, autism are kind of on a spectrum, and they overlap genetically, which is really interesting. And Salome is a great character. She has this wonderful, in Bruce's book, she's got this wonderful, robust life. She's just a phenomenal artist and character, and you love her. And she's got the strongest, most engaging voice in the book. And I think that's really a success and triumph. I think for my book, with my book, I did try to honor the best I could, best parts of my mother, but it really was a chronicle of sort of what happens to people when you don't diagnose their illness, what happens to a family when there's not enough support. So you're right. You want to look at, and for me, my mother went to Oxford. She became a lawyer, and I talk about this. She became a lawyer in England. She became a lawyer in New York, in New Jersey. She had the multi-state. My mother passed every bar exam in the land. She had 4 bar exams. She got them all on her own, studying alone in her bedroom. The woman was phenomenal, and I'm not sure I got that gene. She accomplished a great deal, but I didn't focus on that in this reading. So I did try to honor like the really amazing things. She also had 2 children, maybe 1 or 2 of them are special. So anyway, I think that's a really fine point.
Okay, I'll speak to this, and I'll speak to it from personally, then from a fictive point of view. And thank you so much, Claire, for saying such wonderful things. I never knew my biological father, never met him. I know very few facts about him. The one fact I did know is that he was crazy. And by crazy, I don't know what kind of crazy. I know he was thrown out of the army for being mentally unstable. No one in my family would ever tell me what really was. So when I created Salon, it was because unconsciously I was thinking about, I don't have a diagnosis for him. And I was also terrified genetically that, as you, Claire said, they're finding out it's more and more genetic. So I had a lot of fun writing that character. But it was also scary because I knew where it was coming from at the same time. And I also want to say that no illness, whether it's physical or emotional, psychiatric, should be reductive. And they're all unique, and everybody needs different kinds of support. And that is, as someone who wants to support friends, I have some friends who have big problems. Everyone needs a different kind of support. And I think that we need to be really sympathetic and empathetic about that individually. And as novelists, I think one of the most important qualities for a successful novel is empathy among the characters. And I have fun writing. There, in the quote that you guys put on that Blake put up on the sign from Kafka about Dostoyevsky having too many characters who are mentally ill, I think that makes for a good novel. So internally, I think that works really well, and I think Kafka's quote is correct about that. And I'll leave it there. And if this is the end, thank you, everybody, especially Kailey and Blake and Claire and everyone who tuned in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm so glad to see so many students and friends here. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. It was really great to meet both of you and talk to you about this. Everyone who's still here, Claire and Bruce's books, the links to buy their book are in the chat. So please check those out. Thank you, Blake, for hosting us. And thank you, everyone, for your questions.
Thank you so much. All right. Be well. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Kailey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. Susan.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.